Galatians 1. Last week we just started the book of Galatians. Just a little introduction there. But Paul cut right to the chase pretty quickly about salvation and whether it's the Jews' way or the gospel way, the Christian way. It's amazing to me how many times the Lord just arranges our studies in a way that I could never arrange them. We just covered Acts chapter 9, which is really a parallel passage to Galatians 1. We just alluded to Galatians 1 as we went through Acts 9 about Saul becoming Paul and getting saved. And here we are right in the same passage. And I think the Lord knows what he's doing, and I like to follow his schedule. It's better than one I could put together. When preachers get together, fellowship meetings, preachers' meetings, I've gone to a lot of them over the years. I was drugged to them as a kid with Dad. I'm sure Kimberly was as well with her dad. When they get together, and you who have been to preachers' meetings know, one question that gets asked a lot when you meet a new preacher is, where did you go to Bible college? The reason preachers ask that is because they are nosy, for one, but also because we want to relate, kind of, for lack of a better term, what camp are you in, is what we're asking. Are you with those ultra right-wing people over there? Are you with that liberal group over there? What camp? We ask, what college did you go to? What camps do you take your kids to? Same kind of question, you know? What their standard, it's a nice way of saying, what are your standards? Are you a good Christian or a heathen? And as I told you when we went through Acts 9, Paul went back to school. Saul went to Arabia. He was sent to school in the desert of Arabia. And I'm sure there was a lot of camping going on there. It was really a long night in his life, and the days are hard in the desert too, in Arabia. But it probably felt a lot like a night to him, so we're calling this Arabian Nights. Galatians 1. Verse 11, Paul says, now this is many years after he was saved now, I certify you, brethren, that's just a way of saying I remind you, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man or not according to man. In other words, I didn't get the gospel from any human, I got it directly from God. And that's true. He got the message, the doctrine. The book of Romans was put in his heart in Arabia. Romans includes Romans 3:10 that says it's, how does it put it? I get them confused. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 3:10 is right before that, saying roughly the same thing. There's none righteous, thank you. No, not one. And remember, he was raised in the law where it was all about being righteous. So what a change was made in his heart in Bible college in Arabia, although for him it was alone with God, that he got all the doctrines, everything that he would share in his epistles, and they're all gospel-based about the wages of sin, like Romans 6:23, and whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord, Romans 10:13. And so many of his writings are all centered around those Romans teachings. Well, remember, I introduced you last week to these Judaizers, these Jews who were chasing after the places that Paul would go and going to those churches and saying, We know Paul has talked to you, but did he tell you that you need to hold up the Jewish faith as well, and that you need to keep doing the law as well? Judaizers, they questioned Paul's message. They were a thorn in his flesh. They also questioned his apostleship because he was not one of the original 12. And yet here he is, the Apostle Paul, and he's saying, I was made an apostle directly by Jesus Christ. I got the gospel directly from Jesus Christ. I got the doctrines directly from him. And so they use that to try to cast a shadow upon his reputation and his validity. Verse 12, he said, I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. I'm not repeating what any man told me. I got this directly by inspiration from God. Now, if somebody came to you and said that about some teaching, you might question it too, right? If somebody just came to you and said, God told me. And so something was different, however, about Paul's situation, and that's what we're getting into here as we look at his time in Arabia and then how he relates that to these churches in the region of Galatia. He said, I didn't go to school, I wasn't ordained, nobody laid their hands on me or prayed over me. But I got it by revelation. Now that word revelation we know well because of the book of Revelation. And does it surprise you that the Greek word for revelation is apocalypsis? Apocalypsis. And what word does that make you think of? The apocalypse. The gospel is a revelation as much as the book of Revelation was a revelation. We think of the word apocalypse as just being about the end times, but actually it's about the revelation of Jesus Christ, and the gospel is part of the revelation of Jesus Christ. So don't confuse apocalypse with end times, when apocalypse is really about just Jesus revealing himself. And that's what he did to Saul on the road to Damascus. That's what he did to Saul/Paul, wherever he became Paul there in the desert of Arabia. He was revealing himself and revealing the truth of the gospel and good news. And remember, Jesus is the gospel. He is the good news. The whole Bible is a hymn book. It's all about him. Paul did not become an apostle through Peter and James and John. It was by direct call of Jesus Christ. Verse 13, for ye have heard of my conversation, you know that means manner of life, my manner of life, in time past, in the Jews' religion. You know what all these Judaizers are about. How that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it. He was killing Christians. And profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation. In other words, he was in the upper echelon of their leaders, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my fathers. Paul was very zealous before he got saved. We see his writings and his life as a Christian and as an apostle, and we say he was very zealous after he got saved. Well, he had that zeal before, just in the wrong way. It was just pointed in the wrong direction to wrong things. Have you ever known somebody that was lost, and yet they were very driven, very successful, very serious-minded? And have you ever made the statement about somebody, man, they would make a great Christian? Have you ever done that? I've had that thought about a number of people. What a great Christian that person would be. Now, God can make a great Christian out of anyone. And let's be reminded tonight of the fact that he does a lot of his best work in spite of people, in spite of their talents, in spite of their abilities and all of that. But we're human, and we can't help seeing somebody with great talents, great abilities, or maybe they've got a great personality or whatever, and saying, oh, I hate to see the devil have that one, because they'd make such a great Christian. I think that's what we could say about Saul. He was very zealous, very serious-minded, very devout. Whatever he's going to put his mind to, put his hand to, he's going to go all the way gung-ho with it. He's going to succeed. You could say that he was successful before he was saved. But successful at what? Successful at persecuting Christians. He was very successful at that, just as he went on to great success after that, after he was totally changed and saved. Did you notice in the verses we just read, verses 13 and 14, Paul now calls the religion that he was brought up in, he calls it, look at it, quote, the Jews' religion. Verse 13, in time past, in the Jews' religion. He's not calling it my religion or even my old religion. He's saying in the Jews' religion. He's distancing himself from that. He was saved not in Judaism, but from Judaism. Saved out from Judaism. And he's going to be used to help many now who are lost in Judaism to find their way to Christ, and to prevent young believers from being pulled back into the old ways of the law. Verse 15, we continue. What a tremendous statement here. Verse 15, but when it pleased God, stop right there. God does what he wants when he wants. When it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, when it pleased God to reveal his Son, capital S, in me, that I might preach him among the heathen. Who's the heathen? It's the unsaved as we understand it. But you know what he's calling the heathen here? Is the Gentiles. In those days, they were the heathen. Okay? And the people he's talking to here in Galatia, that's who they would understand him to be meaning when he said here in this verse that I might preach him among the heathen. He's saying God called me to take the gospel to somebody that I didn't even think it was for, to some people that I didn't even think could go to heaven, but now I realize they can, these heathen. Immediately, he continues, I conferred not with flesh and blood. I didn't ask for anyone to train me. Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. And somebody remind me, how long did he go into Arabia, into the desert? Yeah, about 3 years. And then returned unto Damascus. He says, when it pleased God, in verse 15, the will of God was his goal. Verse 16, the Gentiles, as I just pointed out. And then where did he go after the desert? We just saw in Acts 9 him returning for a brief time to be with Peter. And it was 15 days later on in Galatians, clarifies 15 days that he spent with him. Now, stick all that in your back pocket for a moment and let me give you a little more information that we need to go forward. Many years ago, there was a man who called himself a modernist. Modernists would give their own take on the scriptures. Modernists give a more modern version of the gospel. They use the term modernist, but it's just the same old heresy as in our text. Years ago, a modernist, self-proclaimed, wrote a book about Paul. And he gave the Apostle Paul credit for being a great brain. And again, I personally think Paul might have had the greatest mind of any man who's ever lived. This modernist pointed out that Paul was a brilliant student of the law, the Mosaic system, and of a student of Greek philosophy, and said that Paul combined the two to form the gospel, that he combined Judaism with Greek philosophy, and that's how he came up with Christianity. And Paul is saying very clearly right here in our text to these Galatians that he didn't get the gospel that way. He received it by direct revelation. Now, I mentioned Bible college a few minutes ago. I loved Bible college. But I didn't learn nearly as much there as I've learned in the years since Bible college, much of it alone with God, much of it through ministry experience, and much of it from others who poured themselves into me. But honestly, the deepest, richest truths that I have in my heart today are ones that God gave me in solitude, alone with Him, during desert days, during difficult and low times. Let God do a deep work in your soul, especially in the hurt places, especially where you're in the valley or where you're in the desert or where you're alone in solitude. Let Him mold and shape you as the vessel of clay that you are in His potter hands. When Saul came out of the desert of Arabia, it was as a different man. He went in a little younger and very much scarred with hatred and bitterness and no doubt a lot of confusion, but he came out very tender-hearted. He was old school when he entered, all about the law, and had a new perspective when he came out. Look at verse 18. This is what we spoke of earlier from Acts. After 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. Acts 9 and verse 26, you don't have to turn, says, when Paul was come to Jerusalem, he joined himself to the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple because of all the persecution he had done. But Barnabas took him, it says, and brought him to the apostles and declared unto them how he had seen the Lord, that was on the road to Damascus, and that he had spoken to his heart, and how he had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. Barnabas helped bridge the gap and help the disciples to accept Paul as not a threat to them anymore. Now think of the irony of this. The disciples knew better than anyone on earth the huge change that happens in our heart when we're saved. But they looked at a guy like Saul and said, but a guy like that can't get saved. Have you ever thought that about somebody? That person has done far too much. Or they couldn't be forgiven, or they would just never seek it. They couldn't be sincerely wanting to follow Jesus, because we know how against Jesus Saul is. It's interesting to me how God trains his men. Where did God train Moses, by the way? Where did he do his training? In the desert. And in his case, it was 40 years. 40 years of training after 40 years of upbringing in Egypt. And now it's going to lead to 40 years through the wilderness. Those are the three neat packages of Moses' life, but he did his training in the desert. And remember who spoke to him in the desert? Who was it? God. But how did God speak to him? The burning bush. Wow, what an experience that must have been. If you've had that experience, nobody's going to take it away from you. Nobody's going to talk you out of it. A lot of people may think you're crazy, but if you were there and you had that experience, it would change you, no doubt. Where did Abraham do his training? It was in the desert. It was in the desert of Ur, in the Chaldees. Where did Elijah have his experience? It was in the desert too. Maybe we should go to the desert. Seems like God does a lot of good work in the desert. David was trained outdoors in the caves of the earth while he was running away from King Saul, being hunted. It was open season on David. and he was trained in the outdoors. A lot of outdoorsmen we're finding in the Scripture. If you like that sort of thing, you're in good company. Look at verse 19. But other of the apostles saw I none, this is after he said he spent 15 days with Peter, save or except James, the Lord's brother. So he's saying, I did see James at least briefly. But he had no contact with the other apostles except for Peter and James, the Lord's brother. Verse 20, now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not. Some were saying that he got the gospel from someone else. He's saying, I didn't, and somebody's lying. And I believe Paul. I believe in the inspiration of the Bible. That's why. Verse 21, afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea, which were in Christ, but they had heard that he which persecuted us in times past now preacheth the faith which once he destroyed, and they glorified God in me. He said, here's an example of how to take it. Yes, I was a really bad guy, and we serve a really good God, and he saved me like he saved you, and so I'm going in the right direction now. And we should all rejoice at that. The believers in Jerusalem were understandably reluctant, hesitant to accept him. And without the help of Barnabas, I wonder if he would have waited many years before the church in Jerusalem would have actually received him. Barnabas was an encourager who helped bring that to pass. All of them had had that earth-shaking experience, heart-changing experience of being saved and being transformed, and so they got used to it. Yes, God can save anyone. And that's good that they're getting used to that, because they're going to need to get used to the fact that God can save the Gentiles too, which was a foreign idea to them at that point, because they were just a lower life form. Remember, they used to pray each morning, God, thank you that I'm not a Gentile. In verses 21 through 24, which we just read, Paul outlines the first years after his conversion. Would it surprise you to realize that they probably weren't actually the happiest years of Paul's life, even though they were his early years of being saved? Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that getting saved would make a person unhappy. I'm saying that the happiest years of his life were after some time of training, after some time of adjustment to some very big paradigm shifts in his world. And we get part of this from Romans 7, which we're going to come to here in a moment. Basically, there were three periods. I said there were three periods to Moses' life. There were three periods to Paul's life. The first period where he was Saul and he was a proud Pharisee. I already lifted up how smart he was and how dedicated that he was. I want to add one thing to that. I believe that the world would have heard of Saul even if he never got saved. Not just the Christians who feared him, but I think he would have become famous even if he never got saved. He was a proud, dedicated Pharisee, and he thought he knew it all. He hated Christ. He hated the church. He attempted to eliminate the Christians in a ruthless way. This was part of that first of 3 chapters of his life. The second chapter began then on the day when he got saved, when he saw the light on the Damascus road. He was knocked down in the dust and made to realize, you don't know it all. He thought Jesus was dead. Remember what he said on the road to Damascus to Jesus? He said, "Who art thou?" And Jesus replied, "I am Jesus whom you persecute." The one you think is dead and the one that you're persecuting. And by the way, when you persecute my church, you're persecuting me. That was back in Acts 9 we just recently studied. And so when Paul became acquainted with the Lord Jesus, who was alive, he immediately asked him, "Lord, what wilt thou have me to do?" Now here's the rub. Don't miss this tonight, and we're about done. After Paul met Christ, he spent this time in Arabia, and during those first years, he attempted to minister as anyone would, and even should. Okay? After you're saved, you want to share that with others. Nothing wrong with that. But don't miss this. He found out that what he wanted to do, he could not yet do. And that's where in Romans 7:24, you know the famous passage where he cried out, "O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death?" He goes on at length saying, the things that I would do, I can't do, and the things that I don't want to do, I end up doing those. You know what he was doing? He was struggling with sin still, struggling with sin, struggling with powerlessness, struggling with his lack of knowledge of being able to really do the ministry because he couldn't even live the Christian life. He had to learn in Arabia in the desert, I can't even be a Christian without Christ's help. He made me a Christian, but now I can't even walk in the Christian ways without him. He's going to have to do the walking too. And in a few years, he learned that. And then the third stage of his life begins, which was this glorious period as he leaves the desert experience, walking in the Spirit, which is what we're all supposed to do, living in the power of the Spirit instead of the flesh. Don't you know Christians can walk in the flesh too and try to live in the strength of the flesh? He started living this glorious period where we need to be. Did you know there's a lot of unhappy Christians? There's unhappy Christians that are in that second group, in that desert place, in that phase that Moses was in, no doubt, and that Saul was in for a few years as he transitioned to being the Apostle Paul. They're saved and yet unhappy. D.L. Moody put it this way, quote, "Some people have just enough religion to make them miserable." Trying to have it halfway. This is why Jesus warned us about being cold or hot. Don't be lukewarm. Go all or nothing. So no wonder Paul wound up being a great success, because he went all in for whatever he did. Your Old Testament says, "How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. If Baal, follow him." But nothing riding the fence in between. A lot of Christians today have enough Jesus in them now that they can't enjoy the world like they used to. But they still got enough world in them that they can't enjoy Jesus. And they wind up being miserable people, stuck in that desert, instead of coming out filled with the Spirit like Saul did. I personally wish that we had more information about Paul's experience with the apostles in Jerusalem, more information about what God taught him in Arabia. But God's given us what he wants us to have. Perhaps in heaven we'll get to learn some of these other facts. Next time, we get the answer to the next question that a lot of people ask. If Paul received the gospel apart from the other disciples, if he didn't get it from the disciples, then how do we know his gospel is the same one that they got? And in the next chapter, we see how the apostles in Jerusalem were led of God to accept Paul's gospel as being the same one, because he got it from the same person, the same Jesus they got it from. In the meanwhile, if you have an Arabian Nights experience of your own, let God do the radical spiritual surgery in your heart in these moments. But be ready to come out filled with the Spirit, living the Christian life in his strength. And that's the end of that. You can end that.